Okay, and our next speaker is Langdon Winner. Langdon, come on up here. Langdon is most famous for writing a book called Autonomous Technology. You know, autonomy is one of the great characteristics that Ellul writes about. That technology is autonomous. It obeys no law but its own kind of self-development. So autonomous technology, and another book called The Whale and the Reactor, A Search for Limits. Langdon had a long career at Rensselaer Polytechnic University Institute in New York, and now he's living up in Maine, but still at work, working on all these projects. And so Langdon's asking the question, is there any way of resisting this, or does Ellul hint at any ways of responding and resisting? Langdon, it's a joy to have you here. Let's all
Good. It's a delight to be here. Thanks to David for making it possible for me to come and speak after Paul mentioned. It's not unusual, indeed it's altogether commonplace, to see the introduction of a marvelous new technique, technological device, or large system to be greeted with a corresponding wave of social and political opposition. In the early 19th century, to cite a familiar case, systems of industrial mechanization were vigorously opposed by groups of traditional workers, most notably the Luddites, who saw the new water-powered devices as a threat to their human-powered productivity. Later in the century, one finds the use of a traditional agricultural tool, the horse-driven plow, gradually replaced by the power-driven tractor, a shift that spawned several decades of protest by farmers in the USA, many of whom preferred pushing the plow behind their beloved old stallion. Over the decades since then, one finds episodes of organized social resistance focused upon the introduction of a wide range of new technologies, technologies in electrical power, industrial machinery, mass communications, popular entertainment, medical applications, educational devices at all levels, and a good many other movements in opposition and resistance. In my own time, a significant social rebellion and opposition to an emerging technological innovation was the anti-nuclear power movement, a mobilization that reached its peak in the 1960s and 1970s. And over the years, along with others, I've taken up several attempts to propose alternatives to technological devices, systems, and projects that seemed troubling in one way or another. In many cases, a key development in movements of anti-technological resistance was to offer more promising options for ongoing projects in planning and building of technological systems. A significant focus for thinking and activism during this period was, of course, the development of devices in renewable energy and environmentally friendly technologies of all kinds. Thus, there, I would say, is often a two-step movement, identifying technology-centered changes on the horizon that are judged to be potentially harmful, and then proposing specific alternatives, including alternative devices, modes of application that promise more benign outcomes. The writings of Jacques Ellul on problems of modern society brought by la technique and specific manifestations of its power would seem to offer a wealth of opportunities for organized resistance to the disturbances that the introduction of new technologies sometimes bring. His sweeping, deeply thoughtful vision of technique, as well as his descriptions of troubles for humanity, the technological applications and their accompanying mindsets that sometimes bring, obviously suggest openings for new visions, rebellions, and countermeasures. And indeed, there are moments in his writing in which prospects for active resistance to rapidly spreading technological projects seems to be uppermost in Ellul's thought. Thus, at the conclusion of his book, The Autopsy of Democracy, he exclaims, "We are torn between the lure of vain political revolution and the necessity of a technological revolution against which precisely we must rebel. We need every spark of defiance and self-assertion we can muster, a new spirit wholly distinct from traditional individualism and from everything here described as a revolution. We have no legacy to fall back upon. Everything must be initiated." Now, it's conceivable that Ellul was aware of analyses of technique that moved forward to propose practical alternatives and run the risk of obsolescence as everyday institutionalized technical changes take shape. His detailed abstract commentaries about the troubles that technique presents to individuals and whole communities have a distinct advantage precisely because of their lack of reference to specific settings, institutions, and challenges of a given time. So I would say if you read Ellul's best work on technique, he's often rather general and unspecific. That feature of his writings means that the wisdom they offered will not be rendered irrelevant or obsolete with the passage of time. And indeed, the very lack of specific, detailed technological and cultural references assures that Ellul's inquiries will remain fresh and relevant, whatever new devices, settings, and social activities appear on modern society's horizons. And I would include at the top of the book we've already mentioned today, his great book, The Technological Society. Nevertheless, a feature of Ellul's broad-ranging, insightful analyses of La Technique appears at an important turning point in reflections of this kind. His insights do not achieve resolution upon specific, practically useful, instrumentally focused resistance to obviously problematic innovations in the works or suggestions by Ellul for creating significant alternatives. Thus, we do not find in his writing passages that advocate withdrawal from or abandonment of ongoing or proposed technological devices, systems, and projects. Neither does he recommend specific lively opposition to technological alternatives looming on the drawing board. That is not the logical destination where his elaborate, deep-seeking, often fruitful, highly abstract critique of technology leads. The central contribution of his thought is to illuminate the intellectual, spiritual, psychological, and social dynamics of the ultimately monstrous cultural realm that technique involves for how we think, imagine, and ultimately live. Much of his writing sketches an elaborate framework of observations and criticisms about how La Technique continually leads modern societies societies and all of their citizens badly astray. Thus, near the conclusion of the technological society, he laments, quote, that technique encompasses the totality of present-day society. Man is caught like a fly in a bottle. His attempts at culture, freedom, and creative endeavor have become mere entries in technique's filing cabinet. In the end, however, his critique does not move forward from that powerful insight to suggest ways to imagine, plan, or build more humane, less destructive, materially prominent alternatives to the technological accomplishments, large and small, that constitute the dominant forms of apparatus in modern society. Unfortunately, his readers are offered no well-focused strategy that might enable them to explore materially embodied alternatives for the host of nightmares in modern technological culture that Ellul so powerfully describes. In this context, it's important to take notice of the numerous efforts, old and new, that have tried to propose alternatives to the troubling features of technology out of control in modern society. Within institutions of education, for example, there have long been debates about which kinds of methods of teaching and learning and which array of proposed technical instruments, mechanical toys, voice recorders, motion picture projectors, laptop computers, and the like, on and on and on, can be justified as significant components in the teaching and learning of elementary and high school students. Thus, in the present moment, there's a widespread debate about prospects, and there'll be a whole panel on this coming up here, prospects that artificial intelligence, AI, offer in this domain. How will they infuse institutions and practices of everyday life, industrial production, office work, medical procedures, television news, mass entertainment, and especially widespread practices of education? As that debate about artificial intelligence unfolds, the focus upon inquiry, teaching, and learning with AI at all levels, from kindergarten to graduate school, runs hot and heavy. In many ways, the very notion of what comprises a good education today is closely connected to widespread debates about the features, advantages, and limitations of innovative digital technologies, rather than any more general vision of the basic philosophy and purposes and practices of education. Choices within the rapidly developing digital domain of AI, we are often urged to believe, is where the very future of society depends. Ellul's thoughtful philosophical writing about la technique and its consequences for how we live have little to offer, as in my view, I would say, as regards focused criticism of particular technological devices, systems, and their promotion. Neither does he suggest or advocate particular choices, devices, or alternative projects that might lead society and its decision-making activities to affirm. In other words, to affirm more promising, workable alternatives on a broad scale. To be more precise, Ellul's broad-ranging, insightful criticisms of la technique do not resolve in a focused, practical, instrumentally dependent resistance to innovation innovations in the works, much less to any significant suggestions for significant alternatives. And I speak as somebody who's been deeply influenced by Ellul, and I'm trying to describe what I find is missing crucially in his work. As one illustration, one might think that the impressive works of theory and critical thinking that Jacques Ellul would find a good, strong home in today's discussions and deliberations about the development I mentioned a moment ago. One might even conclude that the thrust of Ellul's extensive discussion of the origins, development, and consequences of the spread of law technique in modern society might offer an opportunity for lively, relevant thinking about problems that artificial intelligence presents, as well as alternative pathways for creative alternatives. The problem is, however, that when it comes to Ellul's critical perspectives on technique, his own work gives few specific examples, especially how, in his words, the necessity of a technological revolution against which precisely we must rebel might be achieved in practice. It would be helpful to have some focused, specific examples of what that rebellion would involve. To be more precise, Ellul's broad-ranging, insightful criticisms of technique do not resolve within a focus upon practical, instrumentally focused resistance to innovations in the works, or suggestions for significant practical alternatives that might follow that resistance. Thus, we do not find in his work passages that advise withdrawal from or abandonment of particular ongoing or proposed technological devices and systems. That is not where his elaborate, deep-seeking critique of technology leads. His work illuminates the intellectual, spiritual, and social dynamics of the ultimately monstrous realm that technique involves for how we think, imagine, and ultimately live. Much of his writing sketches an elaborate framework of observation, criticisms, and chilling warnings about how law technique leads modern societies badly astray. In the end, however, his wonderfully brilliant critique does not move forward to propose ways to imagine, plan, or build more humane, less destructive, materially prominent alternatives to the technological accomplishments, large and small, that constitutes the basic apparatus of modern society as a whole. So that's essentially my argument about a kind of vacancy in this great man's work. A relevant comparison might be to the general grand theory in the writings of Karl Marx. As you know, Marx found it crucially important to supplement his brilliant, massive tome, Das Kapital, and his corresponding theoretical works, with shorter, numerous publications that map out what his readers and followers might actually do to overturn the destructive realm of capitalism and build a much different, vastly improved society. So that's what Marx did. He had his grand theory, and then he wrote dozens of pamphlets along with his colleague Friedrich Engels about what working people, everyday people, could do to address this problem. So as important as their works of grand theory certainly were for Marx and Engels, as a matter of historical influence, the shorter, more readable pamphlets of Marx and Engels had much greater audiences around the world, and for better or worse, given this context, and you know the context very well, for better or worse, the wellsprings for the revolution sweeping through societies around the world. So it was obvious that Marx and Engels went from grand theory to a series of provocative manifestos and papers and so forth, which had, and what the very least one can say, tremendous effect on the practices and outcomes of the modern world. Some of that, I think we would say, were not for the better at all. But at least they took that step from grand theory to sort of saying, what would people do with this? What would their strategies be? What changes might they bring in this nation or that nation? Well, one might say, well, Ellul presents us with an exhilarating challenge for social and political action in technological systems, one that we ourselves must map out and apply in practice. And I would say that is probably true. My point this afternoon is that Ellul himself does not take that step. The step of moving from brilliant abstract arguments about general widespread phenomena to particular strategies and activities that might remedy the situation. I'm good. In the end, Ellul's investigations and interpretations of la technique of the human world it shapes and embodies amounts to a vision of a particular pungent variety of totalitarianism, one that seized and came to dominate the world about 3 centuries earlier. This manifestation of totalitarianism is ultimately more powerful and invasive than, say, for example, communism, fascism, or Nazism, although those dreary modes of belief and practice are obviously included in the more malevolent forms of technological civilization that dominate modern politics, economics, and social control. In Ellul's understanding, the tools, techniques, and useful technology-based modes of activity in earlier Western civilization, that is, the building of structures, whole cities, the construction of sailing ships, methods of agriculture, and such like, were actually, in his view, widespread in the Middle Ages. So there were lots of possibilities and devices. And his examples about such matters call attention to the ingenuity and usefulness of particular tools, methods, and even large-scale projects from earlier times. But he notes throughout much of the history of Western culture that these accomplishments were typically regarded as separate and disconnected accomplishments, not part of an overwhelming world-unifying system of technical devices, which eventually that became his central worry. For example, Ellul ponders the contributions of Leonardo da Vinci, and this is in the book, The Technological Society, the great 15th century thinker and technical inventor. He writes, Leonardo da Vinci invented a prodigious number of useful devices: the alarm clock, the silk winder, a machine for carding textile fabrics, and so on, and proposed many technical improvements: double-hulled ships, the universal joint, conical gears, etc. And then Ellul goes on to ask, why did none of these inventions and improvements find practical application? And by that he means ultimately widespread application as the sort of basis of modern civilization. Ellul's complex answer here emphasizes the arrival of the scientific revolution from the early 17th century and onward, an intellectual and practical development that enabled previously scattered accomplishments to consolidate within an extensive framework of reliable principles and interconnected practices. This powerful step eventually penetrated literally every corner of modern life, every activity, every institution, every mode of living that people came to depend upon. In short, these developments resulted in the total dominance of la technique at the very heart of modern civilization. Alas, an unfortunate consequence of this development, in his view, was that it tended to replace totally the separate, distinct, disconnected, lively ways of people being together found in traditional societies in the West and elsewhere. The ingenious particular devices that earlier inventors, such as Da Vinci produced, were primarily separate, discrete entities, not part of a larger, uniform, systematic cultural whole. In Ellul's view, the turning point arrived in that 18th century with the powerful unification of thought, practice, and organization that emerged as the distinctive mania of la technique, a phenomenon that he describes and explains as an unprecedented totalitarian obsession, one that eventually penetrated every corner of modern life, every activity, every institution, and mode of living upon which people depend. In stark contrast, the earlier inventions, such as those of Da Vinci, were primarily separate entities, not part of a larger unified systematic cultural whole. In Ellul's view, the turning point arrived in the 18th century with a powerful unification of thought, of practice, and organization that emerged as the distinctive mania of la technique, a phenomenon that he describes and explains as an unprecedented totalitarian obsession, one that eventually penetrated literally every corner of modern life. An implication of this totalitarian monstrosity is the quest to identify and realize discrete alternatives in whatever domain of thinking and practice one might choose. Any such quest was rendered irrelevant by mentalities and cultural obsessions that la technique provided to society as an overall pervasive presence. Ellul's understanding of this deplorable state of affairs is directly connected to another feature of his experience and vision of the world, his intense engagement with Christian spirituality. At a point in his thinking and writing where he might have sketched alternatives to the pervasive totalitarian regime of la technique in modern society, he moves instead to discuss his views on religious experience, most notably his conviction that a person's salvation ultimately depends upon a sincere, thoroughgoing belief in Jesus Christ, especially Christ's teachings and inspiration as presented in the Bible. So, in summary, he observes, seeing this reality as it is, the technique I have tried to depict could truly be paralyzing and discouraging and could lead to despair. But it's precisely here that the revelation, the accepted in faith, can bring promise, hope, and liberation. It brings promise in the sense that no matter how mad history may appear to us, it is situated within God's promise and does lead to the kingdom of God. It brings hope in the sense that this certainly permits us to live here and now. I'm near to the thank you. Hold on, wait a minute. You get the last paragraph. To conclude then, my view, the ultimate purpose of Ellul's writing on la technique is to offer highly general, often provocative gems of wisdom to his readers with the implied strong message. I think this is ultimately his message. What you choose to make of this world is strictly up to you. I have no particular strategy, no clear, inspiring, technology-centered map for your action or your collaboration with others. Now you're on your own. God help you.